の中にある赤と青き線それらが結ばれるのは真の像
Hi everyone, maayong haanlaw ta inyo lan. Welcome to our educational vlog where we'll be learning some interesting Higaunon words together. That's right, today we'll focus on common objects you can find around the house and everything, but we'll be naming them in Higaunon language. Are you ready to learn? Let's go! Hello, welcome back. Let's start outside the house. This object is called batu in Higaunon, batu in Filipino, and stone in English. This object also called batuyabok in Higaunon, buhangin in Filipino, and sun in English. Amazing, right? Let's move to the next area.
Welcome to the kitchen, where the delicious magic happens. In this video, I will introduce to you some of the kitchen materials, namely in Higaunon. The sink in Higaunon is called hugasa. In Filipino, this is called lababo, and in English, it is called sink. The serving tray in Higaunon is called danwan. In Filipino, it is called bandejado, and in English, it is called serving tray. The low table in Higaunon is called lamesa. In Filipino, this is called mesa kainan, and in English, this is called low table. The plate in Higaunon is called lampay. In Filipino, it is called pinggan, and in English, it is called plate. The fork in Higaunon is called tinidor. In Filipino, it is also called the tinidor, and in English, it is called fork. The spoon in Higaunon is called sudut. In Filipino, it is called kutsara, and in English, it is called spoon. The teaspoon in Higaunon is called kutsarita. In Filipino, this is also called a kutsarita, and in English, it is called a teaspoon. The cup in Higaunon is called baong. In Filipino, this object is called a tasa, and in English, this object is called a cup. The jar in Higaunon is called banga. In Filipino, it's called also a banga, and in English, it is called a jar. The serving plate in Higaunon is called bandejado. In Filipino, this object is called bandejado, and in English, this object is called serving plate. The casserole in Higaunon is called a samalang. In Filipino, this object is called a kasirola, and in English, this object is called a casserole. The ladle in Higaunon is called luwag. In Filipino, this object is called a sandok, and in English, it is called a ladle. The food turner in Higaunon is called a tangkay. In Filipino, this object is called a sanse, and in English, this object is called a food turner. The bowl in Higaunon is called a hong. In Filipino, this object is called a mangkok, and in English, it is called a bowl. The frying pan in Higaunon is called a kawa. In Filipino, this object is called a kawali, and in English, this object is called a frying pan. Rice pot in Higaunon is called a batidor. In Filipino, it is called a caldero, and in English, this is called a rice pot. The kettle in Higaunon is called a takule. In Filipino, it is called a takore, and in English, it is called a kettle. The large pot in Higaunon is called a batidor. In Filipino, this object is called a caldero, and in English, it is called a rice pot. The chopping board in Higaunon is called godata. In Filipino, this object is called sangkalang, and in English, it is called a chopping board. The big knife in Higaunon is called a badi. In Filipino, it is called itak, and in English, it is called a big knife. The small knife in Higaunon is called a tagi. In Filipino, this this object is called a cuchillo, and in English, this object is called a small knife. Don't forget those words. You might need them when you're helping in the kitchen.
Next is the garage. Here, we have tools and materials for fixing things. In Higaunon, this object is called sako. In Filipino, this object is called sako. And in English, this object is called sack. In Higaunon, this object is called pala. In Filipino, this object is called pala. And in English, this object is called shovel. In Higaunon, this object is called kalas. In Filipino, this object is called kalaykay. And in English, this object is called rake. In Higaunon, this object is called wasay. In Filipino, this object is called palakol. And in English, this object is called axe. In Higaunon, this object is called gabas. In Filipino, this object is called lagari. And in English, this object is called saw. In Higaunon, this object is called pantilyo. In Filipino, this object is called martilyo. And in English, this object is called hammer. In Higaunon, this object is called kaliton. In Filipino, this object is called karitilya. And in English, this object is called wheelbarrow. In Higaunon, this object is called piko. In Filipino, this object is called asarol. And in English, this object is called garden hoe. In Higaunon, this object is called bugas. In Filipino, this object is called palay. And in English, this object is called rice. In Higaunon, this object is called asin. In Filipino, this object is called asin. And in English, this object is called salt. In Higaunon, this object is called kauyagan. In Filipino, this object is called pagkain. And in English, this object is called food. Cleaning materials. Time to clean. In Higaunon, this object is called sili. In Filipino, this object is called walis. And in English, this object is called broom. In Higaunon, this object is called sandok. In Filipino, this object is called pandakot. And in English, this object is called daspan. In Higaunon, this object is called bunot. In Filipino, this object is called bunot. And in English, this object is called coconut husk. In Higaunon, this object is called lampaso. In Filipino, this object is called basahan. And in English, this object is called rug. In Higaunon, this object is called pamahida. In Filipino, this object is called basahan. And in English, this object is called doormat.
In Higaunon, this object is called palansa. In Filipino, this object is called plancha. In English, this object is called iron. In Higaunon, this object is called palansahan. In Filipino, this object is called planchahan. And in English, this object is called ironing board.
And now let's head into the comfort room. Here's the thing we usually found there.
First, we have the pail. The pail in Higaunon is called balde, and in Filipino, the pail is called timba, and in English, it is called a pail. The barrel in Higaunon is called badil, and in Filipino, the barrel is called bariles, and in English, it is called a barrel. The basin in Higaunon is called palanggana, and in Filipino, the basin is also called a palangana, and in English, it is called a basin. The soup in Higaunon is called a sabon, and in Filipino, the soup is also called a sabon, and in English, it is called a soap.
In Higaunon, this object called kultina. In Filipino, this called cortina. And in English, this object is called curtain. In Higaunon, this object is called ventilador. In Filipino, this object is also called ventilador. And in English, this object is called electric fan. In Higaunon, this object is called salaamin. In Filipino, this object is called salamin. And in English, this object is called mirror. In Higaunon, this object is called senelas. In Filipino, this object is called chanelas. And in English, this object called slipper. In Higaunon, this object called lilo. In Filipino, this object called relo. And in English, this called watch. In Higaunon, this object called TV. In Filipino, this called television. And in English, this object called television. In Higaunon, this object is called hagdan. In Filipino, this object is called hagdanan. And in English, this object called stair.
And finally, inside the bedroom, in Higaunon, this object called is sabanas. In Filipino, this object is called kumot. And in English, this object is called blanket. And in Higaunon, this object is called alunat. In Filipino, this object is called unan. And in English, this object is called pillow. In Higaunon, this object is called manggad. In Filipino, this object is called tela. And in English, this object is called cloth. In Higaunon, this object is called pagaga. In Filipino, this object is called damit. And in English, this object is called flutes. In Higaunon, this object is called cabinet. In Filipino, this object is called aparador. And in English, this object is called closet. In Higaunon, this object is called baul. In Filipino, this object is called baul. And in English, this object is called wooden chest.
And that's it for today's vlog. We hope you enjoyed learning these common objects in Higaunon language. Thank you.
Don't forget to like, comment your favorite word in Higaunon, and subscribe for more educational video. Thank you!